Thank you so much for joining me for this powerful and important film. My name is Tess Summer. My name is Tess Summer, and I am the program manager for the Joseph Stern Center for Social Responsibility. At the JCC, we're committed to tackling tough issues as a community, and we ask that you engage in this with civility and respect. Yes. Okay. It gives me great honor to welcome our panelists, Dr. Treva Lindsey, Associate Professor at Ohio State University, specializing in African American women's history, Black popular and expressive culture, Black feminism, and more. Lovia, Garkyle, Associate Editor at the New York Times Magazine Labs, whose reviews have been published in the New York Times, The Believer, and the New Republic. And our moderator, Rumaan is a culture staff writer at the New Republic, and he is the author of the novels That Kind of Mother and Rich and Pretty.
Thank you so much. Let's just give everybody a chance to settle. I know you just watched a 2-hour movie, so you're like, let me stretch my legs. For me, I'm so excited to have this conversation, especially with two people who really know what they're talking about. And for me, my experience of watching this movie, the first thing I wanted to know after the movie, which is what I'm going to ask Treva, is, okay, what's true in this movie? And then the second thing I wanted to know is, and this is my question to Lovia, is, does it matter what's true in this movie? So Treva, I guess, looking at the I mean, we can't sort of fact check every fact that's presented in the movie, but like looking at the text as a whole, do you feel like this is an accurate representation of Harriet Tubman and her life?
Good evening, everybody. That's a great question, and it's a quite challenging question. So I watched this as a historian, and particularly as someone who has studied the life of Araminta quite in depth. And I think what is most important about the film for me is that it certainly captures the essence of her story. We meet her right before she's about to run away, but seeing some of the instances that are referenced in the film, including the story about how she's hit with the weight by someone, which causes her what we would now call, which gives her epilepsy, essentially. And so those visions that she has throughout the film, that was the way that the filmmaker attempted to really incorporate that. She saw those epileptic episodes as visions from God. That's how she connected it throughout her life. But it also caused her a great deal of pain throughout her life. So it was an interesting incorporation of both that, her tremendous faith. She is very much so someone who said she always had a Bible and a gun in her travels, which represented some of her politics. The fact that her first inclination to go back was, in fact, to retrieve her husband and to come with her, that she was going back for her family. One thing it doesn't show in the film is really important. She also had 2 children that were part of the story, so it's important to note that she left behind quite a bit. In this text. I understand why that choice may have been made for the context of the film, but her first folks, enslaved folk that she went back to get, ended up being family and friends, people that she knew. And she was going back and taking roots even that she knew and didn't know so well when she was going back and forth, because she had to change roots along the way. So ultimately she did, in fact, free what we know, 70 enslaved people, which is true. At the end, you see her strategizing and planning and executing the Combahee River Raid, which is still to this day the largest military strike ever planned and organized by a woman. Still in American history.
That is, to me, that is one of the most extraordinary facts about this film, right? Because this was quite a long time ago. Like, you would think in the interim there had been one woman.
Someone, but no.
In American history who could lead a,
Right, and in this, she's also someone, she meets John Brown, and she actually is in conversation with him prior to the Harper's Ferry raid. So there's so many important moments that are covered here, and really this film is only covering about 20 or so years of her life. So we don't see her life as an enslaved person, really, in the brutality that she faced in that instance. And when she becomes, after this, both an advocate for women's suffrage, which is a really important part of her life. She dies about a few days after one of the biggest women's rights marches in American history, which happened on March 3rd, 1913. As you can see here, she passed away on March 10th. 1913, so she did get to kind of witness and know that that was happening. And she also, the home that she ends up in, she builds also a home for the elderly, for African-American elderly people. So she's someone who's very concerned with aging rights very early, and also providing services for those with disabilities. So we don't often remember Harriet Tubman as a disability rights activist, an aging activist, as well as a women's suffrage. So we kind of hold her at Combahee, and I appreciated that the film gave us those footnotes. But this life has like 4 more films in it. Harriet Tubman has many more films and stories to tell with her.
And I guess that sort of leads very organically to my next question, which is, does it matter if the film, like no film can really represent the breadth of any person's life, right. And does the film, for you, Lovia, as a critic, does the film have a merit, or what are its merits as a text about this chapter of her life where she was working for liberation?
Yeah, I think, one thing I've really struggled with this film, like the first time I saw it, I had very negative feelings about it, and I was like, this is not enough. This is so condensed. This is trying to do... it's trying to take like a really long and rich life and make it palatable. And then the second time I saw it, I was sort of like, okay, let me just sort of step back and really think about what the purpose of myths are, particularly in a nation like the United States, where really grounded on myths, right? We have our mythical figures like George Washington, Frederick Douglass, like we have those figures have been mythologized. And I think that I started to really think about sort of the role of myth making in biopics particularly. And to me, in that way, the film does just enough, because if you think about it as sort of for an audience that lives beyond us here, or me as an individual who is particularly interested in this history, then it's a pleasant introduction and sort of immortalizes Harriet Tubman in a way that she hasn't been, and sort of canonizes her, right, in the American imagination, that in a way that I don't think she has been, particularly within Hollywood, which, like, for better or for worse, is a really powerful institution. So,
because ostensibly, and I actually have not kept track of like the politics of this, but ostensibly Harriet Tubman will be on the $20 bill at some point
allegedly
in our lifetimes, right?
Right.
That our last president had said this was going to happen. Who knows if it's going to happen? But that effectively reduces her, just as Ben Franklin is like the man who flew the kite and discovered electricity or whatever that story is. And so he's on the $100 bill. But the movie sort of shows her as like a military leader. Like it's more, we all understand, and I think even children understand, because my children who are 7 and 10, like, they have those storybooks about Harriet Tubman, and they understand her as like somebody who saved people from, being condemned to enslavement. But what does that actually mean? Like, what does that actually look like? And so the movie dramatizing that is kind of effective. And it's effective because it doesn't just dramatize like black bodies being whipped.
Right. And I think that was definitely a really intentional decision on the part of Casey Lemons, who is the director of this film, right, to not show Harriet Tubman as an enslaved person. And I think that was really effective. And I think there are parts of this film sort of like, as someone who watches a lot of films, I was sort of like, ugh, this is so corny or cheesy, or this montage, but it might not work for me and my aesthetic taste. But I think that it's important to kind of have a film that is about liberation. And I'm definitely open to pushback about that, but I think that my position is that it is important to see films where liberation is at the center of the narrative, because that is a really big part of sort of the enslaved American story that oftentimes gets pushed back for the brutality and the, I guess, the emotional effects of slavery as a brutal institution.
And I was going to say it's because it's not as dramatic, but of course it's very dramatic.
Right, yeah.
So it's weird that you're right. This sort of there is a visual language, there's a cinematic language of the enslaved body that is very different from the liberated body. And I'm also glad that this film made the latter choice. But Treva, as an historian, does it imagine yourself 20 years from now meeting incoming freshmen who saw this film as young people, and that becomes their text for thinking about who Harriet Tubman was. Like, how do you feel about the way that cinema kind of supplants written history?
That's a great question. I think all of us are coming in from some starting place engaging this. That can be our textbooks, that can be films, that can be stories that we've been told by ancestors. And my job as a historian is to get my students to ask some new questions of these things. And I think this film, at its best, prompts some questions, because there is a reference back to the violence that they endured. When they take off their clothes, you can see the marks on their body. So you don't necessarily need to see the violence to know that the mark of violence is ever present in the context of, right, this peculiar institution. Additionally, in it, you get introduced to people like William Still, who's so important to the anti-slavery history of this country. I mean, he really is this instrumental figure. Marie Buchanan is not a real person. The person Janelle Monáe played.
Wow.
So just so you know. But she is a composite of free Black women who did have spaces like that, who were in and part of this network. And I thought it was important that that was highlighted in the film, the role in particular that women played in this larger history in the context of enslavement and liberation that happened. And Bigger Long is also not a real character, the guy who's chasing him. And it's interesting that the two most brutal deaths in the film are actually them, right? The death of Marie Buchanan at the hands of Bigger Long, and then Bigger Long being shot in the head by Minty's former slave owner. And those are the two deaths. The violence that we do see, in fact, is actually still against Black bodies. So there is a reminder that even in the context of the fugitive, the now free, that we still see that violence, and it's important. And it puts in the fugitive slave law. It lets us know these points that as a teacher, as an educator, they're points of departure that are in here that are so important. I can correct the facts, but what does this bring up for us in terms of questions about liberation? What this look like? What does a freedom fighter mean in this context? How do we put Harriet Tubman beyond the myth? But also, she is a pretty extraordinary historical figure. Right? Like, she's bad, right? She's bad in a very particular way. And she is exceptional somewhat. And it's rare that you have that kind of moment where I'm like, no, this really just makes a whole thing out of nothing. I'm like, this didn't even capture some of the coolest moments of her life and the coolest things about her. And that, I think, opens the door for educators, for stories to really build on that and start to ask the questions about what was Harriet Tubman's commitment throughout her life to this, that she renamed herself after her mother, and at the time kept Tubman her husband, right? It was Harriet who's the first person who told her she could be free. One day was her mother. And then the person that she loved, freedom and love, right, are at the core of who she is. And I think that's a really important thing moving forward in how we teach and talk about both enslavement and abolition.
Yeah. I think one thing that I really appreciated about the film that you were saying, Treva, that made me think of it was the conversations that Harriet has with the people around her. So when she goes back to get her sister and her sister doesn't want to come, right? Or when she's having that conversation with Marie and she's like, have you ever been in a field? And I think those are really interesting because they provide pretty humanizing moments for the work of a sort of any sort of social justice or activism work, right? Which is just that there are conversations between people who you think might agree with you, but don't always agree with you. And I thought the film did a really good job of kind of adding texture to that. I mean, obviously it didn't go into it to the full extent, but it definitely made me ask questions, right? And I think that's that it did that really well.
And I mean, she did pull gun on people who were like questioning her. That's not untrue. Right? She's like, we will all get caught. So you got to either go forward or go back. That liberty or die part is part of how she thought about this. And she saw that call as deeply vested in her faith. Right? To see that connection between the two that she was making. Like, I don't want to shoot you, right? But I actually know that this is what I'm called to do. That she embraces Moses before it's called. She knows that that is her call in life. And she wants to move in that. So when she's faced with loved ones who do question her, and then here they fictionalize some of the dynamic between her and her first husband a little bit, and fudge that just a little bit. He wasn't quite as loving from what we know from historical record as they hear. But it was interesting that they made the choice to show a love between these characters that I thought was important, and I understood the choice cinematically to have that love drawing there, especially from her going back to retrieve her family. But he was a free man of color, and she was an enslaved person. And these were not uncommon dynamics in that area of the country in slavery, right? In Maryland, which we tend to think about as this kind of contested space within the history of slavery. So there are a lot of free people of color, but there are also quite a few still enslaved people. And so relationships between them, how do you have a relationship with someone who's enslaved? How do you maintain that? How do you sustain that? And so asking those questions and talking about the complexity of intimacy and love and desire and even pleasure in the context of this peculiar institution was a very, I think, rich choice that Lemons made.
I was torn about that, and I think Lovia shares my sense that I was wary of the sense that it reduced her motivation to a sort of classic feminine desire to save your romantic partner, but it's the historical record. And it also, in thinking about it, what it also does is shows her as a human being and not just sort of like this galvanizing figure. And, you can see if you go to the Museum of African American, I always get the acronym
History
wrong.
and Culture.
History and Culture. You see her shawl, and it has that remove that you have when you go to a museum and you see a relic of a human life, and it's like looking at a Catholic relic, and you're like, I don't understand what I'm supposed to get out of this. I don't get a human presence, but you can kind of relate to the human desire to save the man that you love, and so that is sort of complicating and makes her seem more than just, a freedom fighter or a soldier of God, but as like a human woman, which I guess I appreciate, but I think it's complicated. I think it's still a complicated choice because it can undermine how you think of this great woman.
Right, but it also gives us something to say that she wasn't someone who intended initially to go back and free 69 other people, right?
Yes.
She got there and she says she's a stranger in a strange land. Yeah. She's alone. She doesn't know anyone. She's never been free. So even the life that is being constructed for her in Philadelphia is very different and unknown. So she wants her loved one back, and it's depicted differently here, but imagine leaving the person that you love in freedom because you're afraid you're going to be sold away from that person. And so now you have an opportunity to go back and retrieve them and your children. And if love isn't a powerful motivation, what is? And I think it's interesting that we read the choice of love as solely this kind of feminine and weak choice, as opposed to a choice that's deeply rooted in accountability to those you care about as a practice. And I think that she gets there and she realizes the vision was, it led me back there, and it ended up not being for John, but had she not gone back for love, she wouldn't have been able to free the first 9 people that she freed, and realized that she could do it again and again and again. And so I think we have to often challenge even our frameworks of thinking about, it's a woman who made a choice for love. Okay, let's dig in there. And what greater reason to think about freedom and connection to love than that?
I think I do wish I had known about, this is my own, lack of research, but I wish I had known that she had kids that she also went back for. And I think that I, as a viewer, was just coming from this where I was like, I don't know if I wanted, and this is it's kind of the question of does it really matter what kind of love you go back for? And that's what you're kind of interrogating, which I really appreciate. Because the love for her family and getting her siblings back and getting her siblings' kids back, I really felt that. But I think I was a little taken aback, and not necessarily and maybe just in the way that is I was just I don't really want this to be just for John, and it didn't end up being just for John, but I think at the beginning I was I really hope this isn't just for John. And of course, as someone who understood the history, it obviously wasn't, but so I appreciate that interrogation.
I should take your class, because I think, it's just I think it's hard to tell cinema operates on so much trope and so much convention, and it's hard to tell when the cinematic trope is interfering with your ability to understand history, which I guess is sort of what my first question was, which is like when a fictional text supplants the historical record, which it does for all of us, and but one of the interesting things about this movie, I think, is that we are accustomed to cinema doing this with respect to Black people in particular with entertainers. I feel like this is the kind of movie you make when you want to win an Oscar, and you make this movie about Ray Charles, or you make this movie about Nina Simone, or you make this movie about Diana Ross, because Dreamgirls is about Diana Ross, and it's kind of galvanizing to see this movie made about like an actual, all of those are real people, but like a woman who really accomplished this remarkable thing that was not to entertain, but like had this much bigger purpose, And I almost can't think of a comparable, there are plenty of great Black figures from American history, but in terms of the kind of person who can resonate with Black audiences, white audiences, young audiences, Harriet Tubman, it's kind of crazy this movie only came out in 2019,
I think it's interesting to remember now, because I think we celebrate that now, right? She may or may not end up on a $20 bill. She is someone we say, there was a doodle on honoring what we believe to be her birthday on Google, right, with her. And it had her in lipstick, which was very interesting, the way they did the doodle. But they did this doodle of her, and she had the lantern, and I was like, where's Harriet's gun? So it was this particular kind of sanitized version of Harriet Tubman that's been recuperated. And I think the film was trying to trouble that. But I also think with a film like this, that you have this possibility that opens up for asking some really difficult questions about not only slavery and liberation, but what does this mean in this moment to watch this film, for this film to come out in this moment, for us to think about her legacy, for us to think about Harriet Tubman as someone who not only freed enslaved people, which we all think is right, but she was a wanted woman. She was an enemy of the state. Right? That is actually what her history is. We don't start really recuperating her in American history until several decades after her death. That's a fairly recent phenomenon that she's seen as that. If you look at the ephemera that we do have about Harriet Tubman, it's wanted posters. It's this Negro women may be dangerous. Right? That's what travels with her. And there's a very concerted effort even in her death, and she dies fairly poor when she transitions, that there's an effort to erase some of her record, to erase some of her story. So a lot of what we know about her, we had to piece together from these different places to be able to tell what we do know. And there's still so much I feel we won't know about her journey. She purposefully didn't talk about the routes that she took while she was doing them, because other people would be using them, or she'd need to go back and do them. So there are things about being a freedom fighter that had to be on these lower frequencies that aren't part of this history. And I think it's important to realize this is a recent recuperation, that we all now are like, Harriet Tubman, American hero. That it was Harriet Tubman, enemy of the state. Harriet Tubman, who was, after that, decided to fight for women's suffrage, which equally met with considerable resistance in this moment. So I think remembering her as someone that is both powerful in our recognition now, but also someone we had to deem as powerful and insist on her being powerful and as an American hero. And she's a very critical patriot. She's very critical of the institutions that are set up in the United States, and uses her life, her body, her will to war against those things to help America realize the best it had never been, right? She's actually the person trying to make America great for the first time, right? She's actually that person.
We're going to take some questions. I was just going to say that it's very apt to say that on Martin Luther King Day, because precisely the same thing has happened to Martin Luther King, right? Like, sanitized into a children's book version of an American patriot. But yeah, if you have your questions, raise your hands. This young lady will find you.
Start on this side. Thank you. Good afternoon, good evening. How are you guys doing?
Good.
I want to say I love this movie, and this movie is very, very unique. And the actress who plays Harriet Tubman, she did a great job, and I heard she's nominated for Academy Award, and that's like incredible. I hope she win. It's a huge deal, by the way. My question is, what is it like working with the actress who plays Harriet Tubman?
None of us have actually worked on the film.
I wish.
But I do think it will be very interesting to see if she wins an Academy Award. And I think that is like that becomes its own kind of complicating thing. Because, of course, the last black actor to win an Academy Award, or black actress to win an Academy Award, won one for playing a slave. And that is something that I think is also worth interrogating, whether or not the institution of Hollywood wants to reward black performers for adhering to what they deem is appropriate material. But I think, Treva, you laid out all of the ways in which Cynthia as a performer, but like just the role challenges, she's holding a gun. Like you said, she's not holding a lantern, she's holding a gun. And that's pretty remarkable, So I guess, I don't know when the Oscars are, but I guess we'll find out soon. Yeah.
Next month.
Oh, great, next month.
Thank you.
Hi, good day. Thank you so much for being here. Thank JCC for doing this. This is just amazing. I am very interested in wondering if there is any way, if anyone has any connection to continuing the legacy of Harriet Tubman. So you said she was for women's suffrage. You said she was for homeless. I mean, all of that. I think the issue that we have is, I think that we only glorify whatever is written in the books instead of extending it. And, they have Bad Boys 3, 4, 5. They need to make, Harriet Tubman, the next one, suffrage, and then the next one, all the things that she did. And they need to do that with all of our people that have been amazing. So do you know, or have you?
So currently, actually, Viola Davis is working on a series about Harriet Tubman that hopefully will make it on, but is an extended and more in-depth look of her life. If you're also interested in some of the work she did in a fictionalized way as well, there was a television show that used to come on called Underground. It was on WGN. It's now on Hulu. But it gives a depiction of a fictionalized group of enslaved people who decide to run away. But in the second season, one of them encounters Araminta. And they develop a relationship in terms of how they move on the Underground Railroad. And it's a tremendous season. And in it, it gives some other additional insight about Harriet Tubman as a freedom fighter as well, particularly how she relates to John Brown. In these longer histories. And so there are all these interesting intersecting points, but your point is well taken. There's the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati is named for her. Incredible murals that are in Maryland and centers that are there that are honoring her legacy and tell this story. And this year, as we celebrate the 100th commemoration of the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, I think we need to elevate Harriet Tubman in that conversation as well, as a very early suffragist, as she's someone who's at anti-slavery conventions as well as suffrage conventions that are happening in the 1800s. So, her legacy is huge.
I mean, and hearing you talk earlier just about her work as a suffragist and on behalf of the disabled or the aging, it made me think of the way that we talked about the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement as only in response to police violence, when it was actually a much more multifaceted community-based approach. And it's sort of like the activism is there, but it's just the conversation is not always taking in the breadth of that activism, right? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sheila. Gosh, this is just all fantastic. And what you ladies bring to it is just super, super. I have 2 questions, but let me tell you something funny. I was maybe about 4. I'm originally from Jamaica. And I heard about the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman. And we have the railroad, of course. You know, the trains running. So it has to be the subway, right? Those were my thoughts, right? As a small tat. I don't know if you've seen Viney Borrow's rendition of Harriet Tubman, which she did a few years ago. She has a one-woman show that she does, The Life of Viney Borrows. I was a speaker at an event where she had done this. The pastor. We don't talk about the pastor. I would like to hear your take on the pastor, because I'm like, wow. Even though there's this voice from the crack in the head that was giving her that spiritual guide wherever she went, the pastor did give her, in the movie, some concrete steps to take. The stars, the river, and we know the whole story of the railroad and that sort of thing. I'd like you to expound a bit more of the character he played.
Yeah. So a character, but an interesting composite of there was a character, a pastor, that was part of this community in Dorchester, and so many people were both covertly and overtly part of what we know as the Underground Railroad. That constitutes a lot of different people. We tend to think it's very clear conductors, someone like a Harriet Tubman, but people who had these insights. As we know, Harriet Tubman was functionally illiterate. So there are ways that she can't read signs. So the movie, when they were like Fifth and Arch, I was like, well, how's she gonna know where that is, right? She might be able to kind of figure it out by going blocks if someone told her you're on First, right? And she could figure it out. But what's important in that is that he is someone who is a free man of color, but is staying in community to be a conduit for other people seeking freedom. And it's very important to think about the legacies of religious leaders in this movement very early on. Some of the most radical leaders in this movement against slavery were deeply tied to their faith. Traditions and the range of faith traditions that were present on plantations, which included Islam, which included Yoruba traditions, which included Christianity, which included all of these things. And so those were important tools that were used. And that representation of a minister in that way, I think, was really important in terms of grounding us in a sense that there were other people who were part of this community of folks trying to get more people to freedom. And that he, as a religious leader, was deeply invested in that, even though he's someone who's stationary. Seemingly, he's a free man of color who's stationary. So he has to create opportunities for this. So saying the North Star, sing these kinds of songs. And then all of the songs that she sings are songs she would have sung in church, or songs she would have known then that are familiar to a religious community that had formed there too. So as much as an enslaved community is around the labor and the practice and the exploitation, they also find these spiritual spaces to congregate and convene, and that end up being liberatory practices for them ultimately.
Thanks. You refer to films of black celebrities. Has there ever been a film made of Frederick Douglass? I mean, he appears in a number of films as a character, but has there ever been a film devoted to him alone? I mean, his life was spectacular. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question.
If there's a movie producer in the audience.
Right, please take note.
There's an Academy Award in the offing for the film of Frederick Douglass.
I actually don't know. I sort of mentioned Frederick Douglass in sort of the American mythology and sort of separate from what we've seen captured on screen. I think there should be a biopic of his extraordinary life. I think there should be several biopics. I think that the role of sort of the biopicture is really important because it is, as you said, sort of an introduction into lives that sort of we historicize but don't really understand, and it can be a means of interrogation. And so if anyone in the audience knows anyone.
Yeah. I mean, there are two biopics of Truman Capote.
Right.
So, I mean, I love Truman Capote, but there are two biopics of Truman Capote, so, you know.
I think, and he's interesting, he's the most photographed African-American of the 19th century, and he's one of the most photographed Americans of the American century. So there's a record for him that we really have for almost no other African-American from that period. So it's right.
Yeah.
So we got a play being written over here, right? Someone, right? So she knows someone who's writing the play. She's not writing the play. She wanted me to clarify that.
Great. I think we have time for one or two more.
I have a question on something slightly different, which is when the issue of the Fugitive Slave Act comes. Could you talk to that? Because I have to honestly say I didn't remember it, given what we remember in terms of history or when. So I'd like to have some sense of how it's taught, and in terms of its relationship in the film, because that really sets everything up. And I'm already saying, what's the role of Congress? How do you bring up the political issues in terms of what Congress was like then, what it's like now, et cetera?
Ooh, okay. I'm going to leave the Congress like now over here for a second. But to speak to that, it's an important moment in the film, and you're absolutely right that it sets off a chain of events with a sense of urgency that happens because there's this immediate response. So the Civil War is bandied about a lot throughout the 1800s. That it's coming, we're gonna have this war because the South wants to keep slavery, the North makes a lot of money from slavery, right? So even though we always frame the North as like this abolitionist pace, a lot of places here also are formerly slaveholding states and benefit from slavery in very real ways. And so this idea of how do we appease and prevent the secession of these states? So the fugitive slave law is actually something that's somewhat of a compromise that happens in this period that's hopefully it's passed with the hope that this will save off a civil war, because it gives slave owners the right to go to any state and retrieve their property. And this is important in terms of enslaved people who are recently free could usually travel to Philadelphia and be fine, or New York and be safe, relatively safe. But at this point, now there are slave bounty hunters who are going, people who can make considerable amounts of money from tracking enslaved people. And that desperation to get enslaved people back and to save this off has people who usually were not really involved in any way or another being like, oh yeah, I saw 3 black people, they might be enslaved people. And if you didn't have papers, which was very, very hard to attain, then you were always in fear of being sent back and being captured and being brought back into slavery. So hence why the Underground Railroad in the 1800s really starts to extend to Canada, right? Because the British had outlawed, abolished slavery by that period. And so, and the place that they were going on, Ontario at that point, was owned by the British Empire. So you could be safe there. But as far as you could get north in the US, you could still be easily returned back to your slave owner. And so that really changes the dynamic of slavery. Philly is no longer safe. New York is no longer safe. The cities that had been safe havens are no longer safe in the same way that they were for recently enslaved people.
It's almost like undocumented.
Right. It shows the fallacy of a policy that tries to appease both sides, right? It shows that the institution has to take some kind of moral stand and say, this is actually how this is going to function, because as we see literally right now in this country, the Republic cannot endure saying like, well, both sides have valid points and we'll sort of split the difference. It just doesn't work in practice.
Right. And there are not a lot of people in Congress at the time, to be clear, who are actually actively abolitionist. There are people who want to save the nation. And the fugitive slave law is one of the many compromises that are made in an effort to save the nation and to save the wealth of the nation, because slavery is literally at the core of producing wealth. So,
Can we please give a hand for Treva, Lovia, and Rumaan? My name is Karima B. Parton. I'm the Associate Director of the Cinematters New York Social Justice Film Festival. We have completed our first year. Can I get another round of applause? Thank you, CSR. Thank you, New Republic. Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Yara. Thank you so much to everyone who made this possible. Thank you, Dad. That's my dad on the camera. Just a few things before you go. Please support our programs year-round. We have Real Abilities Film Festival that highlights people who are different Differently Abled, March 31st to April 6th. Also on social media, if you've been taking pictures, please make sure to look out for us on JCC, NYC Film, also the Cinematters New York Social Justice Film Festival pages on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, hashtag Cinematters 2020, hashtag Impact Social Change, hashtag Lights, Camera, Take Action. And if you just want more tonight, at the New Yorican Poets Cafe, we have partnered with them for Cinematters After Dark, for spoken word and open mic. Thank you so much. I hope to see y'all next year.